Gather around, children. This is the Dice Tower Network.
The Broken Meeple, Season 2, Episode 34, Horror. Tonight you get to hear a special discussion between me and Jason Perez from Every Night is Board Game Night, the podcast, as we discuss the pros and cons of Arkham Horror the Third Edition, comparing it to the Second Edition as well as other Arkham Horror games. Hi guys, this is The Broken Meeple, I'm Luke Hector and you're listening to the podcast. Yes, this is like a bit short notice for another podcast, isn't it? Well, like I said, wanted to give you a little Christmas treat, because over Christmas I'm unlikely to be doing a lot of video content. I'll put some stuff out, but I really need to get down and start crunching on this Adobe Creative Suite, because I've barely started, I've got these courses that I need to do, and I've just been so busy. Work, social life, and getting these reviews out post-Essen. Why do you think I did the compilation video as a way of catching up? And I need to do another compilation video either before Christmas or after in order to catch up with the stuff I've still got at the moment. But I want to use some of the spare days I have over Christmas to really knuckle down into that suite and get Season 3 ready. Hopefully for when the new year starts, or if not, at least a short period into January. I certainly don't want to delay it any longer than January for getting Season 3 up and running. I want it to be a kind of start of the year, new thing for 2019. So what I wanted to do was give you a bonus podcast now, and I've been waiting some time to do this because obviously Jason wanted to put it on his podcast first. Basically what happened was he invited me on his show, Every Night is Board Game Night, and I suggest you go listen to the podcast, it's a great listen. And we get along, we talk a lot about games, we've got very differing views about games, but we have a lot of back and forth banter between us. I like the discussions we have. And it doesn't matter that we don't share the same opinions on a lot of stuff. It's great that we just can talk about this kind of stuff. It's really cool. So what he did was that he invited me on his show for a brief segment to talk about Arkham Horror Third Edition. Now, you might have already seen my review of this on YouTube. But, so you want to get my thoughts on the game, you can see it there. But we wanted to compare not only what Arkham Horror Third Edition was like in general, but we wanted to also compare it to how it fares against the Second Edition. We wanted to see how it fared up against things like Mansions of Madness and the LCG. I wanted to get his views, what did he think of the game, his pros and cons versus my pros and cons, and it was an interesting little discussion and a bit of funny banter here and there. And, it's always a good thing. So I'm going to basically play you the audio that he recorded for it. So we did it on Skype. He recorded and edited it on his end. It's been on his podcast since I think the 7th of December. So I'm now putting it on this podcast in his edited form. I haven't tinkered with it whatsoever. It is purely his work. So credit to him for doing it. But first, I wanted to mention briefly the whole thing with horror games in general, because let's face it, when we say the word horror, we think scary, but in all well and fairness, is there really a game out there that properly scares you? Probably not. We all talk about things in life that scare us, whether it's a phobia like arachnophobia or the fear of dying, that kind of thing, but we also talk about movies that are scary. And, we have movies that do legitimately scare us, whether it's a cheap jump scare, which I'm not a fan of, because anybody can just go boo and scare you, but, ones that actually make you feel a little bit scared and uneasy or a bit uncomfortable. But you never really get that in a board game. And I sort of had to try and think why that's the case, because there's a lot of horror-themed board games. I mean, you've got the Arkham Horror Cthulhu series, that's all about, fantasy-style sci-fi horror. You've got games like Escape from the Aliens and Outer Space that, is supposedly aliens coming to eat you, scary. But it's doesn't really feel that sort of scary. And even Alien Legendary Encounters, it's a card game about aliens that basically ferocious killing machines that eat you alive. It's that should be scary, but it technically isn't. Even when you get things like the Chestburster card and stuff like that, it doesn't necessarily scare you. So why do movies do it? And why don't games? The only way I can think, the only distinction I can make is that, and this also actually applies to video games, because video games can scare you easily. Oh my god, video games can scare you better than some movies can. But again, why those two? And not board games? Well, the main distinction I make is atmosphere. A movie can create atmosphere. You watch the original Alien movie, it's what I believe to be the best horror film, proper horror film of all time. You're on a spaceship in the middle of in outer space. You're claustrophobic with the way that ship's designed. One of your crew members is out to kill you. This alien that you have no idea about is trying to kill you. You know, it's there and you cannot kill it. You have no means of killing it, no weapons that will hurt it, whatever. That film builds up such with the soundtrack as well, builds up such an atmosphere of dread and suspense. And some of it is aided by the music, but also the visuals and just the setting it represents. A movie can do that, sound being a big kicker in that. A video game can do the same. You play something like Alien Isolation or the Outlast games or Resident Evil 7, those games can be scary, but they build up a sense of dread. You hear the ambient music, it's claustrophobic. You most of the time can't fight against the thing that you're fighting against, the thing that you're running away from. Alien Isolation and Outlast and even Resident Evil 7 to an extent, not as much, but to a similar extent, are perfect for that. Because you have to run away most of the time with a camera or some other thing. Like, if you get chased down by the big baddie, you're dead. So that feeling of helplessness is definitely a factor in, causing you to be scared by a movie or, more case, a video game. But again, the sound, the visuals, everything creates atmosphere. I feel like I'm watching the movie Alien when I play Alien Isolation, and that's why that was a genuinely, scary game. Now, of course, jump scares can happen in both, and I find that just cheap. I hate movies that just rely on jump scares. It's not proper scary, it's just surprise, and anybody can be shocked by a surprise. But it does make me in video games edge along a bit slower than usual when I'm walking around, particularly like, say, Resident Evil 7, because I'm just walking around and I'm just half expecting something to come out of the wall at me. And that can fill me with dread, it can scare me, but again, it's because of a jump scare, it's not because of atmosphere. But, that's a side thing. So why can't a board game replicate that? Well, board games don't have the added bonus of sound, and even then, it's just ambient music. It doesn't have necessarily the visual aspect. You're looking at a bunch of cardboard tokens, a bunch of pieces on a board. The game is about you having to think about how to solve a puzzle, or rolling dice, or drawing cards. It's very interactive. You don't feel like you're in a helpless position. You just feel like, I got to go knock over that piece. Roll dice. Yes, I've done it. Or like ghost stories. Wow, we're defending from all these ghosts, but it's basically a bunch of cards on a board. And I think it's kind of like the mental filter in your head. There's a discussion that goes on with things like practical effects versus CGI in movies and that, where with something that's practical, it may not look as good sometimes as a CGI, but you have only one filter to get through in your head. You know that whatever you're seeing is right there, even it may look a little bit cheap or the animatronics might not be as good. But CGI, unless you have got pitch perfect CGI, and we're talking like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, pitch perfect here, there's two filters you have to get through. One, you have to bear in mind that it's basically some creature that doesn't normally exist. But then you also have to get through for the fact that it's basically a computer generated image, which means that it's two filters for you to realise it's not really there. And that's why a lot of shows and movies that use too much CGI aren't that interesting, because it's like, yeah, whatever, I know it's not really there. But, things like the original Jurassic Park film, that was a giant animatronic T-Rex. That was a giant animatronic velociraptor that comes out of the hedge and eats the other guy. It's like, it just works so much better with those. And with that, I feel that maybe it's a similar thing with this. With a movie and a video game, there's only so many filters you have to get through in order to feel dread and feel scared. And the combination of the music, the ambience, the visuals, and the setting, puts you in that position. With a board game, you've just got far too many filters because your imagination has to basically picture everything for you because you're just staring at a bunch of cardboard. So, you've got to realise that there's nothing really scary here. You're just playing a game. You're there to have fun. All of these things come together and just make you realise, yeah, you're not really scared playing this game. You're not really experiencing horror. You can experience tension, but that's a different story. Tension is just like playing a hidden movement game, and it's like, no, don't find me, oh, don't go there, don't go there. Tension's not quite the same as being properly scared. It's just like, you're kind of nervous, you don't want anything to happen. I don't know, that's just a little side topic. It kind of just came to my head whilst I was thinking about horror-themed games. Anyway, but I've taken up enough of your time. I will see you after Christmas on the podcast, so, enjoy the show from myself and Jason Perez. The podcast will end after that audio finishes. And just generally, to all of you, thanks for listening. I will see you in Season 3, probably with the next podcast episode. At least that's what I'm thinking. And just thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I wish you all a very happy Christmas and a great New Year. Take care, and I'll see you soon.
All right, let us get on to the meat of the episode. As I said at the beginning, we are going to be covering Arkham Horror Third Edition. Just came out last month at Gen Con, I think it was. People have been playing it and have a good time. So you can't really review this game without reviewing what came before. I mean, you have Arkham Second Edition, you have Arkham this, Arkham that, all over the place. So I put out the call on Twitter for an expert, someone who's played more Arkham than I have. I enjoy Arkham just fine, but there are people out there that really get into I enjoy Arkham just fine, but there are people out there that really get into it. And my friend, who we've done a lot of projects together, lots more to come. This is the Broken Meeple. Luke Hector, friend of ENGN, is on the show to talk about all things Arkham. Welcome back to the show, Luke.
Sorry. I've already been taken over by Cthulhu.
So we're on a video call. He did the thing where he puts his hand in front of his mouth and does the little tentacle things.
I'm not sure he's got very high pitched on your end.
Yes. So yeah, Luke is a big time Arkham fan. If you saw our top 100 co-ops or heard on the audio, we had a lot of Arkham on there, and most of that was Luke's responsibility. So I'm glad you're here to help us sort all this out.
That's right.
Okay. So yes, let's go right into a comparison with Arkham Second Edition, especially really the critical question is if you have Second Edition or if you enjoyed it at all, is this something new? Is this a genuine Third Edition? Is it a totally different game? Is it not a different game? We're going to parse all that out for you. But let's just kind of give some background. So this is a Arkham Third Edition. The lead designer here was Nikki Valens, who's designed a lot for Fantasy Flight. I think she went freelance at this point, so I don't know if we're going to get more from her in the Fantasy Flight universe, but this is kind of something that I think she participated in Eldratar. She lots of stuff for them, based on the designs of Richard Launius for the first edition and Kevin Wilson for the second edition. So in a nutshell, this is Arkham, right? I think you'd agree, Luke. There's a certain vibe at this point when it comes to one of these big adventure Arkham games. You're playing an investigator, you're on a big board, you're looking for clues, you're fighting off monsters, and 5 hours later, maybe you either win or you go insane and whatever it is. Really what you're in any Arkham game for is the kooky stuff that happens. So there's encounters and there's the mythos thing, which is kind of like the grand global event. There's a lot that just, you see your reflection and, you creep out in horror, or you see this terrible monster, or you get lost in time and space, or you seal your doom with a pact with some eldritch power. And I mean, that's kind of what you're in any Arkham game. I think those are the kind of the basic elements, right?
Yeah, it still feels like Arkham, but what this is essentially trying to do is streamline it from second edition.
Yes.
Because second edition is one that I've had for a long time. It is a solid game, but everybody has to admit right now it is fairly clunky in its rules because it's got a lot of them. And because Fantasy Flight did what they always do with all their Arkham Horror games, which is expand them beyond recognition. It's got so much content in it that if you play with anything more than a couple of expansions, it just becomes a mammoth beast. But it was still always good fun to play. But as you say, yeah, you're talking a minimum of like 3 hours plus to finish any game. I mean, you do these as an event, like around Halloween or on a weekend night. This is not something you take to a game night and say, yep, okay, we're going to play second edition Arkham Horror. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, this is quote unquote the streamlined version. Like, we can kind of argue about whether the third edition is actually, or like, you know, especially in terms of its gameplay, streamlined. I wanted to break it down though. I broke it up into 3 parts, 3 aspects where we can analyze this, and we'll take each in turn. The gameplay part I'm going to leave for last because I think we'll have the most to say. But let's start with the first thing that you see. The first thing that gamers saw when the announcement was first made, which was the board of the new edition and, you know, just kind of the general components. So in Arkham, and you know, I think the thing that links Arkham Second Edition or Third Edition is the fact that it's in Arkham. Like, it's not this big adventure. It's not kind of going place to place to place. It's in one area. It's in like the one city of Arkham, or it's in the one museum or whatever it is. So in second edition, you had this giant board and you needed table space. I mean, if you did table space, I mean, if you didn't have a big table, then go ahead and go grab your TV trays and go have whatever you could to take all those cards and all the other stuff that was there. Smaller, much smaller here in Arkham Third Edition. And the way they pull that off is that they have this kind of, these 5, what is it? Hexes?
They're kind of like weird hexagons. Just looking at the picture here, 5 hexagons, each one split into 3 segments, split by little street tiles, and it's basically like a jigsaw puzzle that you put together, and the amount you put down is dependent on player count, whereas in the past you had the whole board and it didn't matter how many players you had, I don't think. So it condenses it down. You still, in a sense, have the same amount of locations, but if you imagine that on the second edition board, it was one giant rectangle and all the locations were separated out in big lines. Here, because you got 3 per hex, you still have, for a typical player game, you've got 5 hexes out, so 15 locations to go to. So you've still got plentiful places, but it does keep the table space a lot smaller.
Yeah, plus, you know, the street spaces. So you have it, like, it feels smaller, but in reality, there's as many spaces. And we could talk a little bit about the geometry of it. I'm just going to say it, like, a lot of people are really critical of this because it makes it look like a space station, like Space Station Arkham, or, you know, like this has this kind of sheen to it. I got to agree with them. This board is ugly, dude. I mean, I'm sorry.
It's something that I'm not used to, I'll admit, because they're so used to seeing this grandiose board. But I think the whole space station vibe is just because they've seen a lot of games come out where this is used as a space station style setup board. So I think it's kind of, they've been, what's the word? Not biased towards it, but I think they've just kind of like been brainwashed into that way of thinking. Like, you know, this is what you use for a Space Station 1. But in some ways, it does feel a little bit more like an actual city, because you imagine like the rectangle board, you kind of sort of think, right, well, I've got to get all the way from the top to the other end. Nothing loops around. You can't sort of circle the places. It's just a rectangle map. At least with this, it feels more like what a city probably would. You know, if you could go from Rivertown towards the Merchant District to the left or something, but then you could go up to, you know, downtown above, and then straight down from that back to the Merchant District as well. So it just feels a bit more like it's not 3D, but you know what I mean, a full, complete city. And the artwork does help with this a lot, because the other second edition only had this sort of yellow, archaic sort of covering all over it. You know, the only location pictures you ever saw were in tiny little windows, which is all well and good, but, you know, it left a bit to the imagination. Here, all the hexes, every single part of it is one giant sort of portrait or landscape picture on each of the hexes. And I gotta say, the artwork, I feel, has been turned up a notch here, because it looks gorgeous art-wise.
A little dark for me, but I see your thing about the actual art pieces themselves. Like, okay, so you know, I don't know, are you from London, or you spent some time in London?
I've been to London every now and again.
it's as big. I'm from New York City. New York City is a mess. Like, I mean, there's grid systems and everything, but like if you want to find this area, it's very kind of jumbled and chaotic. And this one, everything is so neatly laid out. It doesn't feel, it feels so clinical. Like, I guess that's where the space station comes from. Like, this feels like a very clinical board where, you can go 2 spaces and there's this many options. And it's almost like a scientist came up with this board as opposed to a person who plays games. I don't know. Like, it's funny to be like so critical off the bat, but like it's the first thing you see. And I know a lot of gamers are going to look at it and go, oh, so I'm actually fascinated that you appreciated it more than I did. But I just thought, and plus like the fact that it's modular. Yeah, I get it from a gameplay perspective. You want more modularity, but like it's a city, so in a city is the blacksmith is here and then the florist is there. And then like, all I do is like go 3 days later and then they're switch positions. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm down. So in terms of like the 3 categories, this part, I'm going to say Arkham Third Edition, thumbs down.
There's bits and pros and cons to each. I mean, I can't really say which one I like better out of the 2. You've got a giant board, with all the different locations, but most of it was just, let's have a look at this board again. Yeah, you got like the street map in the background, but then it was basically a bunch of names with green lines sort of connecting them, all the gates down one side, and a little bit of text underneath each one because you had to read a ton of text in the old one just as much. At least the other one gives me a nice picture to look at. And yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it does look a bit clinical from the sake of, right, everything's kind of organized in this modular fashion. But I think that's just kind of the way a lot of games are done these days. Modular is the next thing forward because at the end of the day, I would rather that the locations were switched around every now and again. I mean, it's not like you're playing mode where your first play of this, you've got the map set up like this, and then you're technically continuing a campaign. It's like, well, no, it's a separate game.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what the LCG is for, right, my man?
Yeah, that's true. I still love that one. That is still the favorite.
Nice. Okay, so this one is a thumbs down for me. So let's go to the part that's actually a thumbs up. You open the box, and you start to set up the game. And I wanted to just take a little bit of time to talk about the investigators. So Luke mentioned it, like, this is a quote unquote streamlined, modernized version of Arkham Horror. It says so right in the description. This is why this exists. This is a modernized, streamlined version. I think modernized is the word that they used. So where I have quibbles with the board, I think the investigators definitely reflect advances in the game experience. So in Arkham Second Edition, there wasn't, the characters weren't very exciting. You kind of are all the same, except, your health and your sanity might have changed. You kind of started all the same, but then your health and your sanity might have changed. You kind of started all the same, but then you got items and you got different power-ups that made you different. Here, they do a lot. They do a lot. So you start off with, depending on your character, you start off with certain items, just like personal items, which gets you a little bit more differentiated right away. And you have a choice of those, which is a neat little thing. And then they do this little mechanism thing where you have your stats and you can take an action called the focus action, which buffs your stat. So you get a little token and you can either keep the buff or when because there's a lot of rolling. I mean, welcome to Arkham Horror. You're going to roll your face off. Mm-hmm. You can actually use that buff to roll again, to get a reroll and get what you need. Like, that is so subtle and so cool. Like, I mean, that is not what happens in Arkham Second Edition. In Arkham Second Edition, if you wanted mitigation, you rolled more dice.
Yeah, you had
basically it.
You could buff up some skills, but you had the little sliders which upped and down certain skills depending on what you were doing or whether you got injured. But you did start off relatively similar to each other. You only had some minor differentiation. But this one, from like the first game I played of it, you can tell that a lot of this third edition, yes, they are streamlining the second one, but they have definitely borrowed from Eldritch Horror and the LCG a lot, right, with the rules and the layout, because these investigator sheets look like something out of Eldritch Horror, right down to the 5 stats being exactly the same. And even the concept of focusing is something from Eldritch Horror, but not necessarily to buff your skills easily, because normally you had to do some encounter to buff. Now you just literally say, I'm going to buff law, which is great, because sometimes you might have that time when you grab a couple of items, they're spells, and you generally don't do that. And it's like, well, I can focus a bit of law. Fair enough. Now I can actually be competent. And I did like these starting items and that, because you don't even use them all. You can cherry pick each time, because I think you only pick like 1 or 2 out of 3 types.
2 out of 3.
Yeah,
for a lot of them.
I'd like them to put a few more in just for variety's sake, but it's nice that you actually have a choice. And I can't remember the mobster's name, but he was the first one I played, and it kind of had a choice of, he already came with a giant Tommy gun, and then I think he had something like a talent skill or a giant vehicle, and it's like, well, which one do you think I'm going to pick? I'm going to pick the giant car, and I spent the whole game running over cultists, which is totally what you want to do in Arkham. It's like, is he chanting, run him down?
I will definitely get to what you were talking about, like in terms of like, I'm just going to get in a car and mow them down in the gameplay version, just to kind of talk a little bit more about the investigators. Like in Arkham Second Edition, I mean, you didn't have a lot like so in terms of the feel, like Arkham Second Edition has this big reputation for being just a random fest and not a lot of control out of like the ways that you could do to kind of control what goes on the board. And that a lot of that is because the investigators they start off so puny, and you have the focus sliders, and speaking of fiddly bits, that's the other rap that Arkham Second Edition gets, fiddly. And those focus sliders are kind of like the emblematic of how fiddly it is. It is kind of like weird to manage. Here, it's all cleaned up. They've had game after game after game after game to kind of get this right, and I feel like this is probably, I don't know if it's the best yet in terms of the investigators, but it's definitely really, really, really cool.
I think the only way you can make it any better is go into the LCG or something, because, I mean, these are even a slight improvement on Eldritch Horror because of the fact you can buff your skills. The sliders didn't make a lot of sense from the previous one because you ended up... It was weird. You slide it up the sheet and it made something like your speed higher, but it made your sneak worse. Okay, fair enough, I can sort of get that. But then you had other ones where it's like, your fight is higher, but your will is lower, and it's like two even related. And lore and luck, it's kind of like, why do I have to make a skill rubbish to make another skill better? Why can't I just get better?
Yep, absolutely right. So and the better you make yourself at one thing, it gimped you in the other thing. So heaven forbid you had to actually do a check in that worst thing, like you have to close a gate or something. And that again, actually, you know what? So it's I think thumbs up, right? Thumbs up on, at least the game, the investigator side and like your player abilities. So I have one thumb down, I have one thumb up. So let's get to like the kind of granddaddy, which is the main event. So when we coordinated on email about this episode, Luke, you mentioned before that Arkham Second Edition has a sense of horror to it. And I didn't know what you meant. I mean, I kind of know what you meant, but I just wanted to help you or invite you to elaborate on how the second edition kind of generates that sense of horror and how the third edition kind of compares to them.
I don't mean like when you play this game, you're going to have nightmares or it's going to like jump scare you from time to time. But right. You get like some games where people will play these around Halloween or something. And it was always, when it came to the Cthulhu ones, it tended to be Arkham Horror Second Edition or Mansions of Madness that got played. You never necessarily saw Eldritch Horror being played because Eldritch Horror doesn't feel much like this is a horror story being told. It feels more like this is Indiana Jones with some weird mystical stuff thrown in, which is still fun. Right. But it, like I say, it doesn't... I think expanding the scale out to the world or something made it a little less on the horrific side. The thing I always remember, though, because Arkham Horror was one of my first big games I started playing, was just the imagery on a lot of the Ancient One lists or some of the stories you got in the encounter cards or even just like the feel of the board and that itself. There was just something very innately creepy about it. I mean, you look at the board and that itself, there was just something very innately creepy about it. I mean, you look at the ones these days and an Ancient One may literally just be a picture of the Ancient One. It's like, okay, that's pretty cool. Looks awesome, but, not going to worry too much. Whereas I remember two Ancient Ones specifically in the old version. I remember one being, it looked like this giant head at the end in this pit, and it's got a picture of it basically opening its mouth and two cultists throwing in a lady into it. It's like okay, pretty dark. And then I remember another one, what was she called? Queen of something. It was a Plateau of Leng or something. They're basically like Spiderville or something as far as I call it. And being arachnophobic, she ended up being like probably the worst Ancient One I had to face. But her face basically looks like the Scream painting, that sort of thing, that kind of face, but on spindly legs or like almost spider-like creature, and it's just like, yeah, if I that bit. Maybe it's just because I've gotten used to, like, desanitized on the whole Arkham Horror thing. But there's just something about the second edition that I just thought, even though it was clunky, yes, even though it didn't flow smoothly, the story and the atmosphere just sort of came out with that one.
Right. I think I get what you're saying. I mean, first of all, the art stuff is a real thing. I mean, you're not going to get two cultists throw a lady into the maw of a beast. You know, nowadays you're going to have the PC police kind of saying, no, you know, it'll be, there's certain things that are kind of have been sanitized out of the art, which, you know, you can go either way with that. It's just kind of like, it's there. I mean, there's definitely a difference. It definitely affects the vibe and it kind of lessens that sense of horror. The second thing is, so it's kind of the flip side of what we were talking about with the investigators. Like in the investigators in Arkham Third Edition, you can do a lot. Like, you know, you can kind of affect your fate a lot. There's items, there's rerolls, there's the focus tokens and all this kind of stuff. We had a guy named Danny Lott. He designed a game called Coma Ward, and he defined horror for us on the show. He said, horror is the movie, is your main character in a movie, and you have a gun, but it doesn't work, and you're surrounded by monsters.
Yeah.
If you're in an action movie or suspense movie, the gun works. So, so like the fact that they take so much care to give you so many options and things to do, actually, you know, make you feel more powerful, which is a different play experience. But it's not horror, and if you want horror, then you're gonna have to live with giant randomness and not being able to do stuff on a turn and being kind of, you know, way behind the eight ball and big swings and all kind of stuff. Like, it has to be messy. That's part of the deal. So you're just not going to get that in a quote unquote modernized, streamlined version. So I guess, you know, in the translation, by making it modernized, it might have lost something really important about what made the second edition game so good.
Mm. Well, it's the difference between, I mean, I like that analogy, actually, with the gun. But if I was to put it into movie terms, it's the difference between watching Alien and then watching Aliens, those two films, because both are classics. But if someone's going to ask me what's my favorite horror film of all time, I'm going to say Alien, because that is claustrophobic. You're on a ship. You have pretty much no guns whatsoever. You don't know what the thing is. It's dark as anything. Half your crew wants to axe you off anyway, so you already feel quite helpless, and you've still got this killing machine going around. Switch it then to Aliens, which is still, okay, these are big creatures trying to kill you, but then you have a squad of Marines armed with big guns, and even you end up with your big gun in flamethrower and stuff like that. So even when the Queen appears, it's like, I've still got a big gun in the flamethrower, and then I've got a big art loader. So it's like, it's cool as all get out, but this is kind of different. You're saying that Arkham Horror Second Edition is Aliens, the action film, and same with Eldritch, and the LCG is kind of in between.
This is an action movie of a board game. I mean, to the point where, like, we've talked about the board being so different and the investigators being so different, and now we're talking about kind of the vibe. And we're not going to get into all the mechanics. There's, like, you know, they changed the way you open and close gates, and they changed the way you investigate clues and stuff. But I guess the take-home message of that is that they've changed so much that I think the only thing that's the same is the fact that it occurs in Arkham. And that's what makes it Arkham Third Edition. And I don't know, like, people say, okay, if I have the second, do I want to pick up the third? It's a whole different game. I would say it's a whole different game. What do you think?
It's kind of the way I've gone. I've got the review of it coming out this week, actually, and it's such a hard choice because there's a lot of nostalgia I have for the second edition one because it's in that vault, and it's, you know, I can't sell it off because there's no boxes for it anymore. It's like, it's there. But the third edition is the one that I'm going to get to the table more because it can be long, but it is possible to shorten it a bit, and you can be long, but it is possible to shorten it a bit, and you can still solo it in relatively quick time. But it is just the fact that I can teach this and get it done in a game night is going to get it to the table more often, which is definitely going to boost it a lot. And it has significantly changed mechanically from the second edition. I think that if you've got the second edition and you love it, you could still get the third edition and have them as two separate games. Yes. But Arkham Horror to me is not about mechanics. If you want mechanics, you go play a Euro game. You go play something by Alex Pfister or something, if you want just nothing but mechanics. But Arkham Horror, the mechanics are just there to keep the game going. When you say vibe, that's what Arkham Horror is. It's that atmosphere and theme that you get from it. Yeah, there's randomness and you're going to be dice chucking, but you're living a horror story. There's a reason the LCG gets so much buzz at the moment, because when you play that, it is such a good narrative game. Even if you don't like deck building, any Arkham Horror game you should play should be a thematic experience, which is why when you get these dry Euro versions of Arkham Horror games, cough cough, Study an Emerald, it drives me nuts.
Oh man, you went back to the vault for that one, Study an Emerald. I haven't seen that in years.
Yeah, not since the second edition. Well, I'm not a fan of that, but you got other ones like Witcher Salem and a couple of other sort of Arkham ones which are more Euralized, and it's like, no, this isn't a game that wants to be Euralized. This is one that wants, because I think if any other publisher tried to do Arkham Horror, it would fail. I think you need someone like Fantasy Flight, which is mostly about theme rather than mechanics. That's kind of their shtick, or the way that they tend to be anyway.
Right. Yeah, the dice filling of everything, all the other stuff. If you're Fantasy Flight, you're talking dice. Okay, so then actually, mechanics-wise, there is one thing I did want to note that actually kind of brings home the distinction between Arkham Second and Arkham Third Edition. So it's the way that the scenario plays. So a note that actually kind of brings home the distinction between Arkham Second and Arkham Third Edition. So it's the way that the scenario plays out. So in Arkham Second Edition, it's basically one scenario, but there's different old ones, and the old ones, or the gods or whatever it is, the enemy, will kind of put in a global effect that changes things. So, it might, encourage monsters, or it might, open more gates or whatever. But it's basically, you're doing the same thing. And your Mythos deck and your counter decks are basically giant decks of cards. And whenever you get expansion, just like dump more cards in there, which means you're going to have like wild experiences. And the story kind of emerges from all the stuff that you do. So like when you play a game of Arkham Horror Second Edition, it's going to be like you do a bunch of stuff happens, and then a story emerges from the end of it. So it's like, remember when you did this? Remember when you fell down the hole? Remember when you saw that, that spider coming out of you, and Luke jumped out of his chair and ran into the bathroom and all that good stuff. In Arkham Third Edition, they do a lot more to tell a kind of a coherent story. So you have your initial quest, like your initial scenario, so everything's scenario based, and you kind of have a general idea of what's going on, but you don't know really what to do in terms of the main goal. They keep that kind of open ended. So you basically, it's an Arkham game, so you can be investigating clues, and there's clues in different parts of the board. Once you investigate those clues and you move forward the story, you actually add cards to what they call a codex, and they tell more of the story. And then you have other kind of cards that seed into the different character decks. So then to kind of unfold the story a little bit more piece by piece by piece. The upshot of that is it isn't like an open sandbox at all. Like, the Arkham game or the Eldritch game is way more sandboxy. Here, you're going to go from story beat to story beat to story beat. Fallout game, I don't know if you played Fallout from Fantasy Flight.
Friends of mine have. I haven't, but I get the gist of what you mean.
It's very much they took whatever was done in that game and they put a lot of it into this game, where you have your story cards and they get seeded into the top two of the encounter deck. So you're going to be able to kind of move the story forward, but because of the way it's kind of structured a little bit, it really puts you on it shoots you through. Like, you have to do this part of the story now. It's not like you have a whole bunch of turns where in previous games you can kind of pick your direction a little bit. Like, there was time pressure, but you didn't have to go, you didn't have to go one way. You can kind of a little more open-ended. Here, you kind of have to okay, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and then when I finish this, I'm going to read this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. It felt like a really propulsive kind of pulp action narrative, which I don't know, man. I don't know how I felt about them, to me. But I don't know what you thought about that.
Well, the Arkham Second Edition had this thing with the encounters, because they were cool, they were atmospheric, and they were horrific, and they were my favorite part of the game. But they were quite random, because you had the Ancient One, and you generally had to close gates, and you had to kill monsters. But other than that, I think you might have differentiated the monsters, but I think it was mainly that each Ancient One pretty much just had a special rule on the game.
Right.
So the encounters happened. Yeah, so the encounters were more randomized. You might be dealing with, Cthulhu, and then all of a sudden you're dealing with Yog Sothoth's goat cultists or whatever, like down in the woods, and it's like, well, hang on, that's not even relevant. So it's like that's a totally different area of Arkham.
And there's a spaceman over here. It's like, where'd that spaceman come from?
Yeah, it's to say you got like the Yog Sothoth bit there, and then suddenly it's like, oh, now we're in time and space. Hang on a minute. It's very much more. You arrive time and space. Hang on a minute. It's very much more randomized. Whereas ever since Aldridge and the LCG and all that lot, you have got that more cohesive story, because now the scenario plays out still reminding you, yeah, you are actually trying to stop the arrival of Azeroth here, which is why you suddenly have a bunch of cultists and no deep ones, for example. Why your codex is telling you to investigate these areas. Oh, now there's a big portal in the sky. Right now, go seal it. It's not just suddenly inserting random bits of the Arkham lore, which is not necessarily a modernization thing. I think that's just a general criticism of second edition. That just got fixed, in the sense, because at the end of the day, movies have to do the same thing. They've got to tell a story from beginning to end.
Well, I guess I'll actually push back against that a little bit, because it's the weirdness, it's the crunchiness that kind of makes a cool story emerge after the fact. It's very unique. I feel like I'm playing in this game. I feel like I'm playing someone else unique. I feel like I'm playing in this game. I feel like I'm playing someone else's story. Did you watch you're a video gamer, right?
Now and again.
Mass Effect, the Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3.
I didn't play them, but I have seen a lot of clips and reviews and stuff like that of them. But yeah, I know Mass Effect was heralded for having this really good story for the majority of it, and I remember news articles where fans got completely annoyed and just uproared over what was it Mass Effect 3 ending. Yeah,
the Mass Effect 3 ending. So it was all this branching story you can kind of have different experiences. In one story this guy dies, another story this guy lives, but then at the end of it was the same exact ending no matter what you did. No matter what you did, it was the exact same ending with a different color explosion. And that was their nod to okay, things happening differently. And it's what is happening? Beat to be beat. Actually, I'll only put a pin in that by saying there are choices. So if you let's say you're that first part of the story and either you accomplish whatever it says or you don't, you actually branch. So the path branches a little bit. But even then, I'm branching in a certain area. I can go here and then here and here. And I can kind of fork a little bit, but it's not truly open. So again, that is not a bad thing or a good thing. I think at the end of the day, this is a different game. It's not a better game or a worse game. It's a very different game. It's more propulsive. It's more, action pulpy oriented than some of the more open-ended stuff. To me, I don't prefer it. I like Eldritch. I love Eldritch. And we haven't really talked about Eldritch. Eldritch is kind of my great Arkham game. I love the world stuff. I love the open world end of it. I love the fact that the encounters are you can have an encounter in Rome. You can have an encounter in the Himalayas or whatever. That matters to me. The expansion add little sideboards. So kind of it's even more open-ended. Arkham Third Edition felt very constrained, even with the pathing story. They determine the paths for you. So I can have two paths, but if it's two choices that you're giving me, I still feel a little bit constrained. So Eldritch gave me that open-ended kind of anything can happen type vibe, and I have all the stuff for it. I'm not getting rid of it. So Eldritch is going to be my big Arkham game of choice. Where do you land on that, Luke? What's your big Arkham game of choice?
At the moment, still, Eldritch started off as being my big game of choice, but again, it's going down the way of second edition Arkham Horror, where it's just getting too bloated for its own good. Right. I've still got it. I've still got everything for it, and I still enjoy it when I bring it out, but I suppose it's with that one I have to accept that I'm not really there for necessarily any encounters. It's more that this is an adventure game with some Arkham bits thrown in. I still like second and third edition of Arkham Horror, and to have the encounters and have that little bit of focus. You can have a little bit of branching paths, but it's nice to have a bit of structure. For me, though, my two go-to games are Mansions of Madness Second Edition and Arkham Horror LCG at the moment. The LCG as probably the current favorite, just being okay. Well, you get some branching narrative because depending on how you end each scenario will dictate certain elements that come through the campaign. Did you lose this? You had a sidekick. Did he die or did he turn against you? Well, that's going to have an effect later on. So you do get some branching paths there, and again, you can get an LCG game done in an hour, so it's nice and quick and solid. Mansions of Madness Second Edition, a lot longer, but that gives me the whole. But then that horror element that I miss out of Arkham Horror Second Edition is not in Eldritch. It's this, because you've got the app, you've got the ambient music, it's got all the different encounters and the horror effects that turn up, and you're playing it almost a bit like a dungeon crawl, not entirely, but it's you start off in a room or like in a hotel, and then suddenly you move out, and then you're on the Arkham streets now, and then you go into other buildings and you find the curiosity shop, and then the plot unfolds. Granted, there's only so much variation you'll get from a repeat play, so yeah, I get it. Eldritch Horror can be very different, but then I suppose that's just mainly due to what encounter cards you pick up, which is no different from any other Arkham game.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in terms of, wrapping this up, I think Arkham Third Edition is definitely the most action-oriented of the Arkhams. I see why they call it Arkham Third Edition, mostly for sales, I suppose. It's kind of unfortunate because it creates that question that I don't think needs to be there. This is such a different game. It's so much more kind of aggressive and streamlined, and it tells like that kind of more kind of aggressive and streamlined, and it tells like that kind of coherent, propulsive story. There's so many other games in this universe, and they're all kind of clustered together, but I think this is one distinct enough to kind of have its own life. And if you like that stuff, then go for it, man. If you like Luke was saying, this is probably the easiest of the board games to get to the table. You're likely, I mean, it'll take some time. Like, it'll take you 2 or 3 hours, especially setup. Setup. The setup on this thing is a beast. Oh my God.
You got to get used to that part, but once that's in your head, it's not too bad. But I mean, this is closer to Arkham Horror than it is the other ones, because it's that same plot. You're in Arkham. Here's your ancient one. Here's the gates. Here's the the monsters and that. So it does feel different enough that it does not replace Second Edition Arkham Horror for the fans out there.
Right.
But I don't think I would have called this any other game. I wouldn't have sort of done the Eldritch Horror thing and gone, bro, this is Arkham Horror, this is Eldritch Horror, and this is, I don't know, Arkham Edition. It's like, it's not like that. So yeah, I'm happy that it went Third Edition. It's just not every time somebody puts out a second Third Edition do you have to replace the original one. Because sometimes they are completely different.
Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it is. Like, there's some times where a second edition will just wipe out. Like, I'm looking back here at Darkest Night Second Edition. Darkest Night Second Edition wipes out first. Just throw your first edition stuff away, as far as I'm concerned.
Mission Red Planet is a similar one. Yeah, once
right.
They brought out the second edition reprint, it's like, yep, you don't need the first one.
Yep, this is not that. This is a completely different game. I think there are certain people that are going to appeal to this. I'm keeping my Eldritch stuff. I'm probably not going to go into Arkham Third Edition. I know Eldritch is probably done with its cycle, but it's enough. I have content for years.
We've got enough. I would like them to stop Eldritch, because we have.
I think enough. They might.
We don't need more Eldritch. I've got plenty enough Mansions of Madness stuff, and we've just had. I'm sorry. We don't need more Eldritch. I've got plenty enough Mansions of Madness stuff, and we've just had another expansion out. So I mean, you can keep that going for a bit. Keep the LCG going. I'm more than happy.
Right.
As much as the first part of the intro to my Arkham Third Edition video is me with the violin music in the background looking over Second Edition rule books and that, because it's such a hard decision. If someone says, right, are you now no longer going to play Second Edition? It's like, I've got such that nostalgic connection to Second Edition, but I have to be realistic and think that when am I ever going to get a chance to play it? It's just such a behemoth game, and I'd have to relearn all the rules. At least with this Third Edition, which is, it's on that shelf above Scythe, I can say, if I can't play Second Edition, Third Edition's good enough for me, because the other two I play solo anyway. Right. This one's the kind of one that I can go, you know what, if I've got 3 or 4 people who want to play this, I can at least bring this one out, because I'm not going to have 3 or 4 people playing my LCG or the...
All right, so that does it for the Arkham Third Edition. I think that you guys have a sense of, if you want to buy it, if you should buy it, that is most of what you need to know. Go ahead and check out Luke's video. He's going to have him staring wistfully at rule books, and he's going to be able to have little graphics and everything. And he'll give you kind of some other thoughts that he has as well. Stay tuned here. We are going to get into Arkham LCG.
Thank you for taking the time out of your busy life to listen to this podcast presentation. If you like what you hear, then please check out my other material on my various other platforms. Firstly, the blog, brokenmeeple.blogspot.co.uk, where you can find all my written reviews and links to my other material. You can find me on my Facebook page. You can also find me on Twitter at The Broken Meeple, where you can ask me questions, get in touch, and just generally have a good conversation. You can also check out my YouTube channel, where I'm posting anything from a review to a top 10 list to board game app playthroughs, and hopefully much more in the future. And speaking of the future, if you want to support the Broken Meeple, then please subscribe to the Patreon campaign, where you can assist in helping me keep this blog up and running and try out new ideas in the future. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, and I hope you enjoy listening to my other material. For now, take care and enjoy playing games. From me and everyone else on the Dice Tower Network, have fun gaming.
Remember, folks, Dice Tower Network cares.